Welcome to the Progressive Primitivist podcast, where we believe that the only way to go forward in religion is to go back to the Bible. Over the last several decades, one of the most controversial subjects in churches of Christ has been that of divorce and remarriage. And some brethren hold such a strict view on divorce and remarriage that they will actually refuse to baptize someone unless that person breaks up their remarriage, regardless of whether or not there may be children in that home. And so this is not just a scholarly ivory tower debate. This is a very practical discussion that's going on. Sometime back, Jake and I became aware of Ashby Camp. And Ashby Camp is a very godly and a very scholarly brother in Arizona. And we read a paper that Ashby wrote on the subject of divorce and remarriage, and we thought that it was really exceptional. That's not to say that we track with every view that Ashby holds, but Ashby has done some very, very important research. And we contacted Ashby and asked if he would be willing to present his paper on divorce and remarriage in a series of videos. And he has kindly obliged. And so there are 5 videos in which Ashby presents his view of divorce and remarriage. And we believe that it is worthy of serious consideration. We hope that this study helps you.
This is lesson 4 in the series of classes, Another Look at Divorce and Remarriage. In the last class, I discussed Matthew chapter 19, verses 3 to 12, Mark chapter 10, verses 2 to 12, Luke chapter 16, verse 18, Romans chapter 7, verses 1 to 4, and 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 and 11. Today I want to look at several more sections of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, summarize my general understanding of the New Testament teaching on divorce and remarriage, and then begin addressing some common questions and application issues. So let's pick back up with 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 to 16. That text reads, "Now to the rest I say, not the Lord, if any brother has an unbelieving wife, and she consents to live with him, let him not divorce her. And if any woman has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, let her not divorce the husband. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified in the wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified in the brother. Otherwise, your children are unclean, but now they are holy. But if the unbeliever separates, let him or her separate. The brother or the sister has not been made a slave in such circumstances, but God has called you in peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?" Now in this section, Paul addresses the matter of divorce when one partner is an unbeliever and the other's a Christian. He doesn't specify how that circumstance came about, but he may be thinking of situations in which one spouse became a Christian and the other didn't follow. Now it seems that in the case of such mixed marriages, some Corinthians were arguing for divorce not only on the basis of the suspension of sexual relations as being spiritual, as you saw in chapter 7, verses 1 to 5, but on the additional basis that a pagan partner was somehow unclean or defiling. And you can see how that argument would flow from the same kind of analysis that Paul used in chapter 6, verses 15 to 17, in forbidding sex with prostitutes. It amounts to making part of Christ's body part of the body of a pagan. So you can see how someone would get to that and make that argument. Well, Paul flatly forbids the Christian partner in such a marriage from divorcing his or her non-Christian spouse. If the non-Christian spouse is willing to live with the Christian must not initiate a divorce. When Paul says, he says this, not the Lord, he doesn't mean that his words are not inspired or not authoritative. On the contrary, he speaks as one to be trusted. He says in verse 25, because he has the Spirit of God. He says in verse 40, as Craig Blomberg notes, too often readers have inappropriately questioned the authority of Paul's instructions in verses 12 to 16 on the grounds that these are merely Paul's fallible, spur-of-the-moment opinions. Paul's ironic conclusion to this chapter in verse 40 is actually a strong avowal of inspiration by the Holy Spirit for his entire letter. Now, Paul means that during his earthly ministry, when Paul says that I say this, not the Lord, he means that during Jesus' earthly ministry, that Jesus did not address divorce and remarriage in the case of mixed marriages, marriages between disciples and unbelievers. As Thomas Schreiner observes, Paul merely distinguishes between his words and the words of the historical Jesus. The Jesus of history, as we saw in verses 10 and 11, gave directives about divorce and remarriage, but he did not address the issue of believers married to unbelievers. Paul, as an apostle, addresses that matter here. So as I noted previously, Jesus' teaching in the Gospels about divorce and remarriage doesn't apply to such marriages, doesn't apply to marriages between a believer and an unbeliever. And since it doesn't apply to such mixed marriages, one should assume that it also does not apply to marriages between two unbelievers. That seems to make sense. If his teaching, he wasn't addressing the situation of a believer married to an unbeliever, well, then it seems he also is not addressing the situation of two unbelievers. Now, Paul rejects the argument that the non-Christian spouse defiles the Christian by declaring that, on the contrary, the unbeliever is sanctified in his or her marriage relationship with the believer. This doesn't mean they're saved, something verse 16 makes clear. It means they're not defiling. So it's not like having sex with a pagan to whom you're not married. If the believer in a family didn't have such a sanctifying effect on the spouse, then their children, the product of their defiling union, would be unclean or defiling. In that case, maintaining a family relationship with their children would be impossible, which was something the Corinthians were not willing to accept. So Paul is here engaging in the kind of argument known as a reductio ad absurdum, showing that their position, it led logically to an absurdity. It led to a result with which they were unwilling to live. So that's the point that he's making there. And though the Christian in a mixed marriage is forbidden from divorcing, Paul says in verse 15a that in the event the unbeliever divorces, there's that word charizo. In the event the unbeliever divorces, the believer is to let him or her divorce, meaning he or she is to accept the fact of the divorce, not to act contrary to that reality. Doing so, accepting the divorce, is facilitated by the fact the believer who's divorced has not been enslaved in such circumstances, meaning that unlike some divorces between Christians, the believer is under no obligation to the unbelieving ex-spouse who divorced him or her. None of the marital duties transfers across that change in relationship from unbelieving spouse to unbelieving ex-spouse who initiated the divorce, which I think implies, and many others do, but I think it implies that the divorced believer is free to remarry. As Instone Brewer writes, when Paul says they are no longer enslaved, any first century reader would understand him to mean that they can remarry, because they would think of the words in both Jewish and non-Jewish divorce certificates, "You are free to marry." If Paul had meant something else, he would have had to state this very clearly in order to avoid being misunderstood by everyone who read his epistle. Now, any uncertainty about a right of remarriage in such cases is not a major issue in the church today, because in our society, a divorcing unbeliever is usually quick to engage in sexual relations with someone else. And as I'll explain later, I think that provides a less controversial, in fact, pretty clear basis for remarriage. The instruction given to the believer to accept a divorce by an unbeliever, it's an exception. The rule is that God has called the believer to peace, which in this case means to live in peace with the unbelieving spouse, to maintain the marriage bond. After all, by doing so, the believing wife may eventually save her pagan husband, or the believing husband may eventually save his pagan wife. And though the desertion of which Paul speaks in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, was a divorce, and his instruction to the divorced Christian spouse was to accept the fact of that divorce, it implies that a desertion or abandonment by a non-Christian spouse that in modern Western society is distinct from divorce, that action by the non-Christian spouse justifies the Christian in divorcing the non-Christian spouse. Otherwise, the Christian spouse whose non-Christian spouse simply left them, abandoned them, well, that Christian spouse would be enslaved, would be duty-bound to an absent non-Christian spouse, which seems contrary to the principle of chapter 7, verse 15. Wayne Grudem has argued recently that Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15, not only implies that a Christian has authority to divorce an unbelieving spouse who abandoned him or her, but that when Paul writes the brother or sister has not been made a slave in such circumstances, that he implies that a Christian is permitted to divorce not only in cases of desertion by an unbeliever, but also in other circumstances similar to, but not necessarily exactly like, desertion. And Grudem includes in that category physical abuse, incorrigible addictions, and other circumstances within the category of things sufficiently analogous to desertion to justify divorce. Now, Grudem's argument that the plural form, in such cases or in such circumstances, that means Paul is authorizing divorce for all reasons that are similar to desertion or abandonment, that at best establishes that as a possibility. The phrase simply could mean that in all cases, plural, all cases of spousal abandonment, the abandoned spouse has not been made a slave, which is how it's been understood historically and is commonly understood today. And I think that's more in keeping with the context of the comment. So I don't really agree with that line of argument. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 25 to 28, it says, "Now about the virgins, I do not have a commandment of the Lord, but I give a judgment as one having been given mercy by the Lord to be faithful. Therefore I consider this to be good because of the present distress, namely, that what is so is good for a man. Are you bound to a woman? Do not seek release. Are you free from a woman? Do not seek a wife. But if indeed you marry, you have not sinned. And if the virgin marries, she has not sinned. But such people will have affliction in the flesh, and I'm trying to spare you." All right, having dealt with the married people interested in altering their present situation, Paul now turns his attention to the matter of the virgins that they raised in their letter to him. Now, the virgins, that probably refers to some young betrothed women who, along with their fiancés, were being told by the, quote, spiritual ones in Corinth that it would be sinful for them to go through with their marriages. According to Roy Chiampa and Brian Rossner, quote, "This is perhaps the most widely held view among commentators today." That is what we're talking about when we talk about the virgins, these young women who are betrothed to be married, who are being told or encouraged not to go through with it for some, quote, spiritual reasons. Now, Paul has no command from the Lord on this matter, but he gives a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy has trustworthy judgment on the matter. And he agrees with the general Corinthian claim that it's good for a man to maintain the status quo regarding the virgins. But he does so not because it's unspiritual to marry, but rather he does so because of the present distress. In other words, he would agree that the betrothed should not go through with their marriages, but for a significantly different reason. The present distress that causes Paul to counsel against getting married is some hardship the Corinthians presently were undergoing. Suggestions include persecution or a famine. But whatever it was, the following verses, in verses 29 through 35, suggest that Paul sees it in the larger context of the hardships the church must face in these last days, in the time before Christ's return. He wants to spare them the increase in troubles that being married will bring during this particular spasm of distress they are experiencing in this age of distress. In his examples of maintaining the status quo in relation to the virgins, he says that men who are betrothed should not break off the engagement, seek a release from that bond, and those who are not betrothed, or perhaps those who already broke their betrothal, they should remain so and not hunt for a wife. Though he agreed that the betrothed should not go through with their marriages in the present situation, which would be changing the status quo, he didn't include that as an example because he didn't want to give ammunition to the Corinthians' false claim that it was sinful to do so, that it was sinful to go through with the marriage. As he makes clear in verse 28, this was a matter of wise advice, not a matter of sin. Gordon Fee, he summarizes the argument this way: I agree it is good for the virgins to remain single, but that is because of the present crisis/distress. But it is certainly no sin to marry. Nonetheless, those who marry will experience many difficulties because of the present crisis/distress, and I would spare them that. And if he goes on and he says, what is often heard is that Paul prefers singleness to marriage, which he does, but quite in contrast to Paul's own position over against the Corinthians, we often read into that preference that singleness is somehow a superior status. That causes some who do not wish to remain single to become anxious about God's will for their lives. Such people need to hear it again. Marriage or singleness per se lies totally outside the category of commandments to be obeyed or sin if one does otherwise. And Paul's preference here is not predicated on spiritual grounds, but on pastoral concerns. It is not only perfectly all right to marry, but for those of us who are happily married, it goes beyond all right to good. Now, some argue that 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 27 and 28 allow those who have been freed from a wife to marry another, and thus that it provides divine approval for remarriage after dissolution of a marriage by divorce. But as I explained, verse 27 refers to one who has been freed, or one who simply is free, from a betrothal rather than a marriage. This is recognized by most modern commentators. Though a betrothal was a binding arrangement, there's a material difference between marriage and betrothal. Thus, one cannot infer permission to remarry after dissolution of a marriage from permission to remarry after dissolution of a betrothal. There are two different relationships there. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 39 and 40 says, "A wife is bound for as long as her husband lives. But if the husband falls asleep, she is free to be married to whom she wishes only in the Lord. But she is happier in my judgment if she remains that way, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God." So Paul concludes by reiterating for the virgins who go through with their marriages what he previously said to the married Christians. They are to remain married for life. In other words, divorce is not an option for Christians, with the exception of sexual immorality, which is not relevant to this context. Okay, divorce is not an option for Christians. If her husband dies, however, she's perfectly free in that case to remarry. It is in no way sinful or unspiritual to do so. Now, as I mentioned before, with a large majority of interpreters, I take the restriction where he says she's free to marry only in the Lord. I take that to mean that her new husband must be a Christian. And even if one takes that phrase only in the Lord to mean she is to marry in a way fitting for a Christian, I think one winds up with the same conclusion. As Gordon Fee says, to be in the Lord is to have one's life come under the eschatological view of existence outlined at the beginning, verses 29 through 31. Such a woman lives from such a radically different perspective and value system from that of a pagan husband that a mixed marriage, where the two become one, is simply unthinkable. If she becomes a believer after marriage, then she should maintain the marriage with the hope of winning him to the Lord. But it makes no sense from Paul's perspective for one to engage such a marriage once one is a follower of Christ. All right, now I want to just summarize my general understanding. I think I've made it clear in talking about the various texts, but let me just try to state it concisely, how I synthesize the New Testament teaching. So the only permissible basis for divorce in a marriage between two Christians is sexual immorality, porneia, where one divorces one's spouse for that reason. One is free from the maritally created duty not to marry another. So remarriage by the divorcing spouse in that case is not an act of metaphorical adultery. One who divorces one's spouse for any other reason is not free to marry another, nor is one who is divorced by one's spouse for any reason. To remarry in those circumstances would be to commit metaphorical adultery. In a marriage of a Christian and a non-Christian, if the non-Christian divorces the Christian is free to marry another. Now, regarding this concept of metaphorical adultery, I've tried to explain it in the prior weeks, but it was believed by Jews, Greeks, and Romans in the first century, as I've explained, that divorce frees one to remarry because divorce dissolves the former marriage. Since a divorced person is unmarried, is an unmarried person, and an unmarried person cannot, by definition, commit adultery. A divorced person cannot commit adultery by remarriage or otherwise. So when Jesus said that those who divorced or were divorced commit adultery by remarrying, he was disagreeing with the consensus of Jews, Romans, and Greeks. And the question is the basis of his disagreement, whether he was using divorced or adultery in a sense that differed from how his contemporaries used those terms. Did he challenge the notion that divorce dissolves the former marriage, as they all thought? So when they said divorce, they meant dissolve the former marriage. Did he challenge that notion? Or did he challenge the notion that adultery requires the perpetrator to be married? You see, that was something that everyone understood, that if you're not married, you can't commit adultery. So which did he challenge? Which did he put a different spin on? Did he challenge the notion that divorce dissolves the former marriage? Or did he challenge the notion that adultery requires the perpetrator to be married? Now, most assume the former, claiming that Jesus meant, contrary to how everyone thought, that divorce does not dissolve the marriage when it's obtained for a reason other than one permitted by God. When it's obtained for a reason other than sexual immorality. And they claim that such divorces, so the idea, they're claiming that such divorces for reasons not permitted by God, that they're not merely impermissible. They're not merely impermissible, but they are also ineffective or invalid. So God doesn't permit you to do it, but you went ahead and did it anyway. But the effect of that is it is invalid. It's ineffective. It left you married, despite the fact that you divorced. But because I'm convinced, so that's how most people take it, but because I'm convinced that Scripture teaches that divorce does in fact dissolve the marriage, even if the divorce is undertaken for a reason God does not permit, Well, I opt for the latter. I think Jesus means that one whose marriage has been dissolved by a divorce commits adultery in a metaphorical sense by marrying another. That is, he or she violates the duty not to marry another that arose from the marriage, but which in the new covenant, Jesus informs us, survives the dissolution of the marriage. The offense is like literal adultery because it is a violation of a spouse-specific, maritally created obligation, but it is not literal adultery because the former marriage has been dissolved by the divorce. Now, this distinction has major implications for the validity of the new marriage and for what's required in the way of repentance for sinfully remarrying. Now, that's summary. I hope that's clear, at least how whether you agree with how I'm seeing it. I just want to at least communicate it. But having said that, it leaves some important questions unanswered. Okay, and I want to try to fill in some of those gaps by addressing some specific questions and application issues. And the first one I want to address is this idea: why think Jesus intended the exception for sexual immorality, sexual infidelity, porneia? Why think he intended that to be the only reason for which divorce is permissible? Now that's a good question. Now, Hillelites allowed, as I've explained, they allowed divorce for any reason. But David Instone Brewer, he insists that even the Shamites allowed divorce for grounds beyond those spelled out in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. Most notably, for a failure to provide food and clothing pursuant to a popular interpretation of Exodus chapter 21, verses 10 and 11. Now, he argues from that claim that Jesus' essential endorsement of the Shamites' understanding of the grounds for divorce in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1, that should not be read as excluding grounds for divorce that were rooted in other texts. Jesus wasn't speaking about those texts, okay, in Instone Brewer's presentation. And if the Shamites could read Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, as restricting divorce to cases of sexual immorality and still leave room for divorce on other grounds based on other texts, well, then so could Jesus. In other words, he claims that Jesus' silence about other grounds for divorce that were widely accepted in first century Judaism should be construed as Jesus' acceptance of those grounds for divorce. Now, there are a number of problems with this claim that he makes. And the first is the assertion that the Shamites accepted divorce for neglect based on Exodus chapter 21, verses 10 and 11. That's at least questionable. Grudem, in his comments on Instone Brewer's argument that Instone Brewer makes in his book, Grudem objects, saying, while he, Instone Brewer in his book, provides evidence that many Jewish interpreters referred to Exodus 21, 10 and 11 to teach about the responsibilities of a husband and wife in marriage, I could not find evidence on pages 100 to 109 of Instone Brewer's book that all Jewish interpreters agreed that the neglect of food, clothing, or marital rights were grounds for divorce. I could find, number two, I could find no evidence in his discussion on pages 100 to 109 that specifically demonstrated that the followers of Shammai held that neglect of food, clothing, or marital rights was grounds for divorce, or that the Shammites believed that something indecent in Deuteronomy 24:1 included neglect of food, clothing, or marital rights. So the first problem or weakness here is this question, this lack of clarity that the Shammites actually went along with what Instone Brewer asserts. But even if one grants that the Shammites accepted divorce for neglect based on Exodus chapter 21, verses 10 and 11, Jesus never approved of those grounds. On the contrary, as I've explained, Jesus speaks universally in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, as in Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, where he says, everyone, whoever divorces his wife, except on the grounds of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. See, leaving no room for divorce on other grounds. That Jesus intended the exception to be the only basis for divorce. That's supported by the fact his statement in Matthew chapter 5, verse 32, isn't in response to a question presented to him by the Pharisees, a question that was couched in terms of the rabbinic debate between the Hillelites and the Shammites. It's his teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, a sermon in which he intensifies or radicalizes God's will under the old covenant for the life of disciples. It is a sua sponte, from himself, on his own, declaration made with no reference to the rabbinic controversy. So one can't assume that his comments were restricted to that debate, that he was speaking only on the grounds of divorce specified in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 1. And even if one denies that the universal language with which Jesus repeatedly expresses the exception, even if one denies that that means sexual infidelity is the only acceptable basis for any divorce, there's still no adequate reason to insist that Jesus accepted other grounds for divorce. In that case, one's left with the claim that Jesus' silence about other grounds for divorce should be taken as his acceptance of those grounds for divorce. But that's not persuasive. As William Loader explains, the problem is the claim that the silence on the matters of material and emotional support based on Exodus 21, 10 and 11 should be taken as an indication that they continue to be assumed as legitimate grounds for divorce. The fact remains that nowhere in the New Testament do we find any hint that breach of obligations except for sexual infidelity is ground for divorce. How do we interpret the silence? Instone Brewer must assume that hearers would assume the legitimacy of divorce on all these other grounds when hearing Jesus' prohibition of divorce, and in their minds gloss the latter with that insight. That is, Jesus was not speaking about normal divorce and only meant that it cannot be based on trivial grounds. Is this likely? It seems even less likely to be the case in the part of the sayings which refer to marrying divorced people. Would one really expect people to hear that as referring only to those divorced on trivial grounds? As Instone Brewer shows, the early writers beyond the New Testament interpreted the prohibition of divorce strictly, allowing an exception only in cases of adultery. And although they too would have affirmed the vows of material and emotional support. They did not see breach of these as grounds for divorce. One can argue, as Instone Brewer does, that this was because the early church, quote, lost touch with its Jewish roots in or before 70 Common Era, end quote. Is such discontinuity credible? On balance, it seems to me more likely that the silence about the breach of marital and emotional support in the context of determining grounds for divorce in the New Testament stems not from the assumption that they're still valid, but from the assumption that they are not. Other evangelicals argue that the stated exception for divorce was not intended to be exhaustive, but rather it represents a principle that divorce is permissible for egregious violations of the marriage covenant as exemplified by sexual immorality. In other words, the claim is that one can extrapolate from the express exception for sexual infidelity to exceptions for comparable assaults on the marriage covenant. Typically listed would be physical abuse or abandonment. Now, this is a position argued by such scholars as Craig Keener and Craig Blomberg and David Atkinson. And the general concept, it's a familiar one. We understand, for example, that the Bible's specific condemnation of drunkenness expresses a principle by which we condemn modern forms of non-alcoholic intoxication. The question is whether it's appropriate to apply that concept to the exception in the Lord's teaching about divorce. Now, my resistance to this claim stems mainly from the fact an exception clause, it serves to identify matters exempted from a general statement. So it seems more natural to read it restrictively rather than illustratively. That just seems to make more sense, unless there's some clear contextual indicator to the contrary. For example, in exempting close relatives from a priest's duty not to make himself ceremonially unclean for people who die. Leviticus chapter 21 verses 2 and 3 says, except for a close relative, such as his mother or father, his son or daughter, his brother, or an unmarried sister who is dependent on him. Now, if that text had stated simply that he is not to make himself ceremonially unclean for people who die, except for his mother or father. If that is what the text said, I don't think one would be reading that exception correctly to assume that it represented a principle by which all close relatives were exempted. In other words, because it's an exception, I think unless I have some reason to read it differently, the natural way to read it is to read it restrictively, specifically, as I say, rather than illustratively. So that's really what steers me. I understand the argument that's being made, but for me, it just doesn't persuade me. But all right, so I don't know how many more classes I have. I don't know that I can finish with one more class, but one or two. Don't know when I'll get to it. I hope it'll be soon. But again, thanks for hanging in.
Thank you for watching this video. If you like this content and if you want to see more of it, please leave a like on the video and be sure to leave a comment underneath telling us what you thought about the video. And please subscribe to our channel for more content like this. All right, I hope everyone has a great day.